I worked in the Pentagon as assistant to Chairman Powell when he was working for Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. He is the ultimate realpolitiker. He is the ultimate realist with a hyper-nationalist twist. Dick Cheney did not go to Iraq to end terrorism. Dick Cheney went to Iraq to gain access to the second largest known oil reserves in the world.
But that was then, of course, and this is now. A new dawn, a new administration, and a president whose own roots lie as deeply in Africa as in the United States of America. So will Africom be different under Obama? Can the US overcome its past mistakes in this continent? Well, perhaps there is a lesson in Rwanda, because today Rwanda and the US have one of the closest military and diplomatic alliances on the continent, and not that long ago that would have seemed impossible.
Rage Omar reporting there for Al Jazeera. Well, Callum McRae, you produced and directed that documentary. Just how sensitive is Africom? I mean, just how carefully did you have to tread?
With Africom itself.
With Africom, and indeed with those African governments that you approached for an answer to see whether or not they would deal with Africom or why they were turning away from it.
Right, well, there's two questions there. In terms of Africom itself, they were very open and allowed us lots of access, and, you know, they clearly believed in their mission.
They thought they had nothing to hide?
Well, certainly they gave the impression of feeling they had nothing to hide. In terms of how African nations felt, that of course is a huge area of sensitivity, not least because most African nations' public position on Africom is actually slightly different from the reality, which is that on the ground there is more cooperation. On the ground, where America turns up offering, you know, big bucks and resources and all the rest of it, the response is not quite as critical as it is in public. I think that's fair to say. That's certainly my
When you
impression.
started on this journey, did you have any idea where it was going to lead?
Well, it was, I mean, when we started on this journey, we actually started looking at this subject and looking at making this film before the election of Obama.
Right.
So we were looking at a body which was very much a product of the kind of neoconservative ideology.
The Project for the American Century, or whatever.
The Project for the American Century,
yeah.
And it was, I mean, you know, Africom probably wouldn't accept this, but I think few people would deny that the motivations were to do with these two motivations: one, the war on terror, so-called, and the other, the need to secure oil reserves, and the fact that, you know, Africa was now such a hugely important source of oil for America. So that was its function, that was its main, and also, of course, underlying that and the background to that was the effective destruction of the State Department and the huge power of the Pentagon. So that what was happening and what was very much the danger, and I'm not convinced that danger hasn't gone, was that America was now focusing its diplomatic, its humanitarian, and its international strategic interests and its international diplomatic relations through a military organisation, Africom.
Right. So some people were naturally a little bit concerned about this. Knox Chitio, do you think they're right to be? I mean, what's your starting point with Africom? Because I've spoken to some Africans who look at the States and see it as a beacon of democracy and, you know, pluralism, and say, we need a fair amount of that in Africa. If it comes through Africom or something else, then fine, let's get them here.
Yeah, I think when Africom first started back in 2005, 2006, they marketed themselves pretty poorly in some respects, because the impression given was that Africom wanted an HQ in Africa, and it was mainly to serve a military function. I think over the years, certain African governments have thought towards it. And, you know, I think to be fair, there's some bad aspects of Africom, or some dubious aspects, which I think need clarification.
We'll clarify those.
Yeah, I think, for instance, the initial thrust that it's to do with the war on terror did not go down well in Africa, for obvious reasons. But, you know,
for obvious reasons, why would
well,
those
I
be
think
obvious?
I think the idea of lumping Africa, or lumping the war on terror in Africa and making Africa part of a U.S. agenda did not go down, did not play very well to an African
Having
audience.
said that, a few years earlier, of course, in 1998, we'd had those bombs in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi, and we'd had problems in the north of Africa, and then, of course, go to the Horn, problems there. So you can see why some people might say, actually, yes, this is a global thing, and Africa is part of the theatre.
Yes, but I think there needed to be a rather more graduated approach, because simply saying the war on terror is part of Africa, I think, was a little bit inaccurate. But I think over time relations have thought, because Africom is doing some good humanitarian work in Africa.
Really?
In terms of medical, they have a medical section, for instance, within Africom, which is doing quite a lot of work with.
And in what way are they distributing
with
this
so
medical expertise? I mean, are they doing it in the same way that NGOs have done, or are they doing it differently because they're a military kind of structure?
Well, certainly it's a military structure, but they do have trained like medical personnel which work in theatre with medical teams in various countries. So there's that aspect. So there's the military aspect, which people, I think, are right to be a little bit concerned about. But there's also the development aspect, which Africom also is involved with. So I think sort of the blanket condemnation of Africom, which was there 2005, 2006, I think that has mellowed a bit. But there's still some questions.
And in your opinion, I mean, is this fair, this shift, is it reasonable? I mean, are you quite open-minded at this point as an analyst?
I think one needs to be fairly open-minded. I mean, part of the problem was, as I say, was that Africans were very concerned that, this is America coming in and saying we want an HQ in Africa for U.S. military forces. I think Africom has, well, they were told in no uncertain terms by African leaders and African people that this simply won't fly.
So they were speaking in one voice on that occasion.
Africans, I think, spoke in one voice and made it very, very clear that this will not fly. Africom cannot be headquartered in the States. So even in that sense, that's quite a breakthrough that Africans have let America know and formed opinion in the U.S. about what will work and what won't work. So I think that in itself has been quite important.
Okay, and Callum, at the beginning of your investigations, before President Obama was elected, were you pretty open-minded? And during the course of your investigations, did you find yourself saying, actually, I'm not sure about this? What did you do?
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think what's very interesting about Africom is the two ways it's presented, and indeed the two ways you can look at it. Africom is unique. Basically, America divides the world into military commands, a situation which some people might find slightly disturbing. But and there were it was 5, and Africa didn't have a military command of its own. And so, in a sense, the creation of Africom was simply a piece of rationalization. It made sense that the continent of Africa, broadly speaking, should be under one military command. But then what happened next was that they started to say this command is very different because, for example, it has 2 deputy commanders, one of whom is a representative is from the State Department, is a diplomat. So does this mean